Why we don't see more priests publicly rejecting the errors coming from Rome. People sometimes ask, why don't we have more priests on YouTube openly calling out what's going on with Francis, with the American bishops, with the bishops in Europe, South America, wherever? Why is it that there are so few who do? And why is it that the ones who typically do either are very vague in how they talk about these things, or they've been canceled and are the only ones who do it? And I'll bring to mind for you the story of the YouTube channel, The Sacristy of the Vendée. A few months ago, they made international news when they were essentially, says the priest there, working out of, I believe, Spain, publicly said some pretty not nice things about Francis. The kind of things you usually only see from Recognize and Resist type lay YouTube channels like myself or Taylor Marshall and Kennedy Hall and folks like that. It's become pretty obvious that most priests won't do this. And the easy answer for some people is that most of the priests aren't really aware of what's going on. But that's actually not the case. There's quite a lot of them who are. It's just when they do so, they risk getting not only canceled, but smeared, viciously smeared. And so we're going to talk about this today because, well, you're going to see what happens when priests do this. So we revisit the case of the Sacristy of the Vendée because that broke in the news yesterday. So headline from Crux Now. Church sanctions priest for being an online troll. Online troll. That's interesting language. I only usually hear that from a particular side of the political spectrum in the secular world, who refer to people who won't abide by the spirit of the age and their spirit of revolution. But usually it's usually in secular discourse, secularists on one side and the other arguing. And usually this language is not ever brought up in church discourse. I was a little surprised to see that headline because, frankly, the Bergoglians have a much wider vocabulary than to invoke this stuff. So this was very interesting. But that's not actually the smear. I mean, that's bad enough. Most people don't take the accusation that someone is trolling all that seriously anymore because it's the internet. It's been like this for 25 years at this point. Anonymity is part and parcel. It's why I don't take anybody all that seriously who whines online about people using fake names on the internet, because it's been that way since the beginning. But there's an accusation here, and their reporting on this in the American press is a tad different than overseas. I'm going to thank the viewer who sent me a couple links to some overseas reporting on this, because he gets a little bit more honest, even if they're hostile to him, to the priests here. So this article says this priest who was telling the truth about Francis, they're implying that he was a McCarrick type, which is interesting because, again, the foreign press, the overseas, the Spanish language press doesn't say this at all about him. And trust me, those articles aren't written in a friendly manner about him either. If there was even the whiff of that about him, they would rightly expose it. Read a few articles on this from overseas, and we'll talk about this here from their perspective in a second. Let's go to hear some facts about this. Quote, this week, a public spat on social media platform X, previously known as Twitter, no one calls it X, revealed that a Spanish priest has been barred by the Vatican from his online activities for trolling who was harmed by a Peru-based group under investigation. In a May 7th post on X, Spanish Father Francisco Delgado, who lives in Virginia Dale, Colorado, in the United States, announced that, quote, by direct order of the Archbishop, I am forced to interrupt activity on all my networks and suspend my participation in the media. A high-ranking source confirmed to Crux the Archbishop received the request from the Holy See. Let's pause here. Back in 2018, 2019, Bishop Robert Barron proposed, and never said it again because of the response, that the Holy See should come out with some sort of marker to give to the various bishops' conference that would allow them to show which Catholic media was approved by them and which was not, in a way to essentially undermine all the independent Catholic media out there. The pushback he got from that was legendary. But in that, we started getting some interesting word from Rome that they do, in fact, pay attention to online Catholic content creators. So since then, I have been joking about how you should all pray for the poor seminarian or low-level priest, or now I guess layman, whose job it is in Rome to watch my channel. Please say a prayer for them that they may continue in their service to the church. But we know that they do watch all of this stuff, all of it. They pay attention. Whether that's a good thing to do or not, I'll leave you to decide. But this is more proof that they do pay attention, because he was saying this stuff on Twitter. We go on. This time I'm not doing it of my own free will. I have no choice but to defend myself against a slander that I hope one day to be able to give details about, he said, insisting that despite the persecution against him, I continue to maintain my purpose of being faithful to the Church of Christ and to its visible leader, who is Pope Francis. So again, he's not allowed to defend himself against the things they're saying about him. He is one of six. He's Father Delgado, one of 6 priests who regularly appear on the popular La Sacristie de la Vendée, the Sacristy of the Vendée channel. Said he would be offering the suffering this situation has caused for the conversion of those who harm the church from outside and from within. Long live Christ the King. In a response post on Twitter the same day, a man named Jose Enrique Escardo Steck, also known as JEES, said that in midst of so many stupid attacks by... Well, this has to be some sort of local language thing that I don't get. Stupid attacks by a t-shirt. There comes good news for me. Maybe that's a way of saying empty suit. And then the article goes on and kind of makes some nasty implications about this priest. And the whole thing is weird. Very weird. Because, as you'll see here, we don't get this at all from here. So let's go down to Religion Digital. Because their story is a little different. So their headline is Archbishop of Toledo sanctions Francisco J. Delgado forced to interrupt his activity for disaffection with the person and ministry of the Holy Father. Now, you remember, in that quote from Crux, he actually says Francis is the Pope. He acknowledges Francis as the Pope, and he even says that he's, has affection for him and all that stuff. But Sacristy of the Vendée has been very, very vocal about not letting these kind of evil things from Rome go by without comment. And that's where they got into trouble. This goes back several months. I reported on it back when it happened, when it initially happened. And then I was beginning to wonder what was going to happen to them, because they had essentially gone radio silent on their podcast. They stopped doing posts, but now they're posting again. And this is when they dropped the hammer on them. So let's just go down to this part here. Quote, Delgado is, along with Pater Gongora, one of the co-presenters of the self-proclaimed counter-revolutionary gathering, from which continuous attacks are made against Pope Francis, the reforms of this pontificate, and the media, bishops and priests considered progressives. So in other words, the content would be very similar to what you see in most Recognize and Resist kind of YouTube channels and podcasts. A few months ago, La Sacristia had to suspend its broadcasts after one of its participants, Gabriel Calvo Zarote, asked to pray that the Pope would go to heaven soon. Was actually the quote. They say they don't use the word heaven, they use the word die. That's not what he said, that he would go to heaven soon. Some may say that's splitting hairs. I think there is a difference with that, though. A good part of the priests who participated in the gathering are part of the same group of traditionalist priests trained or assimilated in Toledo Seminary, considered by many to be one of the most conservative in Spain, and which to date had not taken the timely decisions to stop this traditionalist drift. End quote. And so there it is in the media. These priests are the product of a seminary that is too conservative for Spain and too conservative for the church. Remember, we'll invoke Cardinal Roche here. Not only Cardinal Roche, but several other prelates have repeated the statement, and Francis has basically said it too, which is the traditional Mass, the same Mass that developed organically from apostolic times and was the primary form of the liturgy said in the Latin West, with some variations from religious orders and things, but was the primary form of the liturgy in the Latin West until 1970. Apostolic times to 1970 no longer fit the ecclesiology of the Church after Vatican II. Ecclesiology being the theology of the church. What is the church? What it means to be the church. That form of the liturgy for 1900 years was no longer applicable to the church. This is more evidence of that. You see this language of a traditionalist drift, meaning a Catholic drift. The seminary was training Catholic priests to be Catholic priests once again. Now, that article is not exactly from Friendly Press at all, but note how it doesn't exactly imply any kind of McCarrick's-type association with him, nor does it say he went after a group online who were having problems with this, like they were saying in that other one. Instead, this is the group of priests who ran one of the biggest Spanish-language YouTube channels in the world, where they interviewed the likes of Cardinal Mueller, Bishop Schneider, Cardinal Burke, and other bishops, and taught the faith while openly resisting Francis. And they did it while acknowledging Francis as the Pope, which for sedevacantist means that they were engaged in an error, as well as a lot of the Pope splainers will say that. But this is what they do to those who resist. They smear them, they denigrate them, and they silence them. Now, the interesting thing about Father Delgado is he was living in exile here in the United States, in Colorado. I don't know if he still is or not, but he's not even allowed to respond to the things they've said about him. And we'll go to another source on this story, because the story keeps getting stranger and stranger and stranger. So we go to Religion Confidential, I believe is what this website is. These are all Spanish language websites that I'm using extensions to make so you can see what they're saying. So their headline is, the Archbishop of Toledo forces the priest Francisco Jose Delgado to interrupt his activity on networks and media. Known for being the director of the counter-revolutionary YouTube channel La Sacristia de la Vendée, the Sacristy of the Vendée, he was already reprimanded by Francisco Chato for disaffection with the purpose or with the person and ministry of the Holy Father. He's being reprimanded and silenced because he's speaking out against Francis. Again, people ask, why don't we see more priests standing up and speaking out publicly? This is why. If you want to know why you don't see it in your parish, if your parish priest gets up one day and says, Francis just issued Dignitas Infinita, and he says a bunch of wonderful things about all these social issues, but buried in it is a bunch of heresy. And then he starts talking about the errors of this concept of infinite human dignity, a concept utterly alien to the church until the post-conciliar era, how it's heresy, yada, yada, yada. That priest will probably be silenced at the very least. He may, in fact, be removed from active ministry. I've gone over research data for you that shows that even in the United States, Francis is loved and or at least really well respected by 75% of Catholics. That means that priest standing up there can't speak explicitly about the errors coming from Rome, because he will absolutely be getting a call from the chancery if he does. That's why. And that's why you don't see priests on social media doing this too much either. Yes, there are a few priests now who teach the faith, who have, very social media friendly personalities or gaining a large following, but watch carefully to see if they're actually explicitly confronting the errors of Francis. And if they're not, you know why that is. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. The priest has to be careful. They must tread carefully. I speak with a couple of priests privately in emails and through Patreon and other places. And they tell me a lot of things, but they can't say those things publicly. So whenever they say, go ahead and use this, but please leave my name out of it, there's a reason for that, because this is what will happen to them. So from Religion Confidential, quote, at that time, Archbishop Chato did not force them to close their YouTube channel, but the priests of this program decided to strategically suspend their counter-revolutionary priestly tertulia, broadcast every Thursday at 9 p.m. Spanish time, in which current political, ecclesiastical, and cultural issues are analyzed. Okay, so this sounds like a typical YouTube Catholic recognize and resist thing. In fact, it sounds a lot like the Remnant more than anything else, except it's done in Spanish and it's done by priests. However, the Archbishopric of Toledo then issued a statement in which it admonished them for, quote, disaffection toward the person and ministry of the Holy Father, forced them to ask for forgiveness, and announced other corrective measures. However, a few weeks ago, the Sacristy of the Vendée resumed its broadcast with songs such as The Shroud and The Shroud of Oviedo in defense of the Valley of the Fallen, or one responding to and taking on the ideology of the flesh prevalent in the world today. End mostly quote. So the bishop basically told them to stop doing what they're doing, issue an apology, seek forgiveness. And then after some time of suspending what they were doing, they went back to making content. And this is where they got into trouble. And you notice those three that I talked about don't even talk about the church really at all, at least church, church politics, if you want to call it that. When you're doing about videos about, sacred relics and issues noteworthy to Spain, and then just the general ideology of the flesh overtaking Western civilization right now, those are not necessarily things that he would even mention Francis, but it didn't matter. They came back and they got silenced again. The Valley of the Fallen story, if you're not familiar with it, by the way, is interesting and it's important to Spain, and it's important to Catholics broadly speaking, but in general, it's not the kind of thing that should have gotten them in trouble with the Vatican in saner times, but we don't live in those times. Now, I'm curious what you think about this story. Are you surprised that a priest got silenced? Because he did issue a statement saying he would basically comply. And so now he's gone, again, radio silent for who knows how long. They threatened his faculties, even though he's here in the United States now, which then begs a question. Who in the church in America put pressure on him? They had to have. I mean, there had to be some American bishop there somewhere. Sonny Jim says these true Catholic priests need to organize themselves if they need to go on strike. If there's enough of them, Pope would have to listen. Maybe. There are a lot of retired priests out there who probably pick up for them. And trust me, those retired priests lean more heavily towards the Gregorian side of things than they do the Catholic side of things. This is the most difficult time for good priests and bishops who care about their flocks in the church. If they say anything, they get canceled. That pretty much is true. I want to show you, now contrast this to a couple other stories that I'm following here. I tweeted about this one yesterday to give you an idea of how bad this really, really is. And so we're going to go here to a website called US Catholic for this story to give you an idea of what people are allowed to get away with in comparison. What does the Eucharist mean to you? Does the church's emphasis on the Eucharist distract Catholics from Jesus' teachings in the gospel? Take our survey. Believe me, I took their survey. Does the church's emphasis on the Eucharist distract Catholics from Jesus' teachings in the gospel? I'd love to know what they mean by that. Because a hardline Catholic can read the gospel and say that Jesus' teachings in the gospel were predominantly about repentance, knowing your place in the hierarchy of creation, submitting to God, following his law, all those things. A modernist would emphasize their very selective reading of the Sermon on the Mount and a few other places in the gospel where they get their sort of seamless garment theology about Jesus really wanting you to be out there active socially. So I don't know what they mean by this. Here's the very short blurb that goes with it, because it has a survey, and I took the survey already, otherwise I'd show it to you. I don't usually do calls of action here. Very rare beyond go pray, but I'm going to put a link to this in the live chat. I recommend everybody take the survey. So here's what they say. This summer, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops will host a National Eucharistic Congress as part of its year-long Eucharistic revival, meant to, quote, restore devotion and understanding to this great mystery. Some, however, have argued that holding this revival amid the ongoing worldwide synod has placed the U.S. bishops in conflict with the Pope in Rome, emphasizing spiritual piety over the Church's mission in the world. Can the two coexist? Does the Church's emphasis on the Eucharist distract Catholics from Jesus' teachings in the gospel? Does the Eucharist give you the strength to live out Jesus' teachings? What does the Eucharist mean to you? U.S. Catholic wants to know. So I took the survey, and boy, does it ask some really bothersome questions. It asks you, do you believe in the real presence? Do you ever avoid receiving communion? And I believe they use the word take, which is not the terminology you should ever use when talking about communion. You receive it. You do not take it. There is a difference. That difference in the language really emphasizes our role, our place in, again, that sort of hierarchy of creation. You receive it as a gift from God if you are worthy, you don't take it like it's something you are owed. People tend to forget that. But the language in that survey is very interesting. And U.S. Catholic is based out of Chicago. The under the Cardinal Archbishop Blaise Cupich, who submitted his retirement in March. His birthday was, I believe, on the Feast of St. Joseph, and he was required, when hitting 75, to submit his letter of resignation for retirement. And if the Pope accepts it, he is immediately retired. Francis has not accepted it, because of course not. Cupich is one of the voices for Francis in the Church in America. They have never been, to my knowledge, reprimanded. Not in the same way that, say, the National Catholic Reporter has been reprimanded. You remember the National Catholic Reporter puts the word Catholic in their name, and their bishop told them repeatedly, you can't use the word Catholic in your name because that implies that you are an officially sanctioned ministry of the Church, which you are not. The National Catholic Reporter rejects church teaching on a whole lot of things, and that outlet has refused to comply. U.S. Catholic has never been sanctioned, even though they're asking you some very wild questions there, implying that, very heavily, that piety over the social mission of the Church in the world. The Church has always engaged in corporal works of mercy. These are the things like, in the modern world, that means running hospitals and having food boxes for the poor and that sort of thing. The Church has always done this stuff. Even more so before the so-called Reformation, especially in England and other places where church property was seized, and all of a sudden the peasants were at the complete mercy of their lord, or at the complete mercy of the state. The Church did those things and still does those things. No one in their right mind would have said that those things detract from the Eucharist, or the Eucharist detracts from those things. That when you understand the faith, it's all integrated together. It goes back to that old debate. Protestants accuse us of having a works-based faith, where we're told, oh, you have to do this. You Catholics believe you can work your way to heaven. No, Jesus commanded us to do works, so we do works. It's part of it. Your faith isn't real unless there's some sort of external manifestation of it by doing what Jesus told you to do. That's what it is. And sure, it looks different for most people. The works of mercy the list of the works of mercy are so exhaustive that most Christians in general do them. This includes praying for other people, are considered a work of mercy. There's no conflict between the Eucharist and those things. There shouldn't be, but there can be when people, I think, overemphasize the social side of things, turning the Catholic faith into the parody that Protestants believe it is. And so please, here is in the live chat now, that I'll try to put a link to. I'll put a link to that in my show notes at returntotradition.org. And maybe I'll even do it in the comment section, so you can look at that yourself and let them know what you think. Sorry, U.S. Catholic, your results here are probably about to get skewed in a way you did not expect it to. My apologies, I guess. But that's just one of the two things here, because they went after those priests that I talked about briefly before, and then you get this story from Francis himself, which is, of course, not that surprising. So there is a actual conference going on in Rome right now, multiples of these things actually, but for our purpose, this one, he is meeting with at a conference that is being hosted by the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development. This happened 2 days ago. Yes, there is a Dicastery for Integral Human Development. This is the secular world's stuff, just repackaged to make it sound Catholic, but really, I got my PhD in public policy, focusing on all policies all related to green things. And this stuff here, what you're about to hear from him, sounds exactly like the stuff I had to read in grad school, except, tried to make Catholic sounding, but in substance, it's exactly the same. It's part of the secularization of the faith. And this is why that U.S. Catholic article asked if this is sort of a repudiation of Francis's program because it's focusing on piety, which is a weird admission, by the way, because you would expect the Pope to promote piety, wouldn't you? Piety, holiness, seeking out sanctity should be part of the process in Rome. But here it is. Again, this is a very short address because Francis can't give long addresses anymore because of just his condition now, which is not surprising. Here is his address. See how much of this sounds Catholic to you. Dear brothers and sisters, good morning. On this occasion of your meeting, I am pleased to welcome all of you as partners of the International Labor Organization, Episcopal conferences and religious congregations, Catholic and other denominational organizations, trade unions, and other grassroots groups engaged in the project, The Future of Work, Labor after Laudato Si. Pause here. I'm laughing because I don't know what world you live on when these kinds of organizations are considered grassroots. They're not. They're top-down organizations. They haven't been grassroots ever. The old guild structure was far more grassroots than this stuff, any of these groups. Anyway, over the past 6 years, you have engaged in reflection, dialogue, and research, proposing innovative models of actions for fair, just, and dignified work for all people in our world. I thank the superiors of the dicastery for promoting integral human development for their encouragement of these efforts. I also thank the International Catholic Movement Commission, which has worked to coordinate and manage the project. Thank you so much. In the coming days, your gathering will focus on the theme, Care is Work, Work is Care, building a worldwide transformative community. Does that sound Catholic to you? I don't think it does. This will enable you to advance to the second phase of the project, employing the method of shared social discernment. There is a real need to pool all our personal and institutional resources in order to attempt an adequate interpretation of the social context in which we move, seeking to grasp its potential, while at the same time recognizing in advance those systemic ills that become social plagues. That literally sounds like stuff that I had to read and write papers on in grad school about social sustainability. That's exactly right out of the secular playbook. You have identified 5 issues of crucial importance for society as a whole. I would like to mention them briefly. First of all, dignified work in mining industries. As I observed also in encyclical Laudato Si, the export of some raw materials for the sole purpose of satisfying the markets of the industrialized North has not been without consequences, some of them quite serious, including mercury or sulfur dioxide, etc., etc. Second theme, dignified work and food security. And then he starts talking about food problems in some places. Dignified work and then movement. You get the idea. This is secularism. This is the secular program. Remember, the sacristy of the Vendée got in trouble for correcting the errors of Francis and for teaching the faith, having those bishops that we sometimes quote here or read their statements from pretty regularly, the Schneiders, the Muellers, those types of bishops on their channel as interview guests. And then they critique Francis. This is why you don't see priests doing this, because whenever they do, they get the hammer dropped on them. It's very rare that you will ever see a priest get away with correcting the errors coming from Rome. You should not use the word social, the social pope, glorified social worker. I would disagree only because Pope Leo XIII started the grand tradition of what we call Catholic social teaching, which was the church writing a body of documents, meaning through the Pope, correcting the errors we saw coming from the secular world in the 2 competing theories of the secular world on economic and political things. The errors of like unfettered ultra-libertarian capitalism on one side and the stuff Marx was inspiring on the other. And that body of work built upon itself until basically 1958, when the church took a remarkable shift in its direction after Vatican II. And then the documents under that same guise were very different. It became like the tools of the social or the secular elite. That's what they became. I know it's what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, essentially. And it was I began having a crisis in terms of when I was writing my dissertation on how do I present this, because before Vatican II the documents all made sense. After Vatican II they don't make sense in light of the pre-Vatican II stuff. They're very different. And Catholic social teaching is fine, but it gets so misappropriated by people now to advocate for the kind of stuff Francis is pushing. Mary received Jesus. Temple guards took him. There is a marked difference. Jesus was handed over by Judas. Communion in the hand is taking him, just like the temple guards. That's definitely one one way of describing it. But And Frank says, this piece makes me wonder if Pope Francis actually does see the church as the mystical body of our Lord Jesus Christ. I've never heard him use the term mystical body of Christ before. In fact, you might be hard-pressed to see the post-conciliar popes doing that in general. The term the people of God is definitely a post-1960s kind of terminology. Before it was the church militant. Right? Church militant was not just the name of a YouTube channel. It's the term the church used for centuries. You have the church suffering in purgatory, the church militant on earth, and the church triumphant in heaven. That's what you had. And then the term people of God became kind of a more nouveau kind of thing, and also very inclusive, too, of Protestants and other groups. Connor says, I'm actually catching you live this morning. I'm awake and currently can't go back to sleep. Yeah, I know how that feels, Connor. I know how that feels, especially if you're the Connor I think you are, which means you're kind of sort of a neighbor of mine up in north of Oklahoma City. I understand. But yes, Sam says this is a lot of psychobabble in that statement from Francis. Right. But priests can't critique it either. If they do, they get the sacristy of the Vendée treatment. That's what happens to them when they say that stuff. DH basically reminding us Francis treats the church as an NGO. That is what they want. The secular world wants that. They just want the church to be like the king of the NGOs, basically. All right, folks. If there's any... Okay, that's Connor confirms that's who he is. Yeah, that's what I thought. All right, folks. Any final thoughts in the live chat this morning? Because you should pray for the priest from this and the priest of the sacristy of the Vendée after they have been essentially shut down by the Vatican, who have absolutely confirmed that they are monitoring all the Catholic YouTube channels. They have absolutely confirmed that at this point. So please pray for them. Pray for whoever's job it is to watch the American commentators. That's got to be a really arduous thing to do for them. But did I see that Novus Ordo Watch talked about the video did with some guests about how traditional Catholicism is great apostasy? Yeah, I watched that. And I thought Novus Ordo Watch did a very good job of taking it down, actually. I would actually, not a sedevacanist. I don't endorse sedevacantism, but Novus Ordo Watch has some great commentary. And that episode of theirs on this subject is fantastic. They do so much better job of taking down Saul's statement there about how traditional Catholics are. The growing traditional Catholicism movement is the great apostasy as foretold in Scripture. That's what they're saying. Novus Ordo Watch is a good takedown of that. I'd just recommend you go check that out on their YouTube channel or their podcast. All right, folks, thanks very much for tuning in today. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.